So I decided to take to Twitter and ask you guys what kind of video you wanted to see next. I gave you some options in a poll, and the winner was just slightly marginally over my penis, GPU Buyer's Guide for Q1 2017. And that's what we're going to go over today. Before we begin, let me just stipulate that 40 nanometer cards, that means Fermi generation cards on the Nvidia side and Radeon 6000 series cards on the AMD side or older, are off the table completely. Given the power they consume, the fail rates at this point, the age of the cards, it's just not worthwhile to invest in one. I would say at the very most, the best performing versions of these cards might be worth about 40 bucks at this point, at most, if you are a buyer and you're looking to put together something ultra super cheap to mess around with. Anyway, on to the real categories. Starting at the bottom, we have here on my chart the RX 460. Now, if you're looking to emulate that performance with an older generation card you can pick up secondhand, you've got lots of options. As always, any 2GB version of any Pitcairn GPU. This includes the Radeon 7850, 7870, R7 370, R9 270, R9 270X. All those cards make great options that will give you relatively close performance to the RX 460, as well as the GTX 660 Ti on the Nvidia side, along with the 760. Why have I left the 660 off this list? Well, Kepler has gotten a giant kick in the balls, and it seems they've been absolutely ignored by driver updates. If you check out Gamers Nexus's videos on the GTX 770 and the 780 Ti, you will see precisely what I am talking about. Anyhow, with the RX 460 coming in at 122 Canadian dollars in my market here in Toronto, I would expect to pay about half of that for any of the cards I mentioned, depending maybe $5-10 bucks in either direction on the age of the card, what it's been succumbed to. Of course, Bitcoin mining is a thing you have to remember, and a bunch of other factors that I've gone over before. In terms of which of these cards I think is the best value, I would have to say the R9 270, simply because it's not too old to be considered a significant risk like the Radeon 7000 series, and it's not so new like the R7 370 that it's going to demand a premium. As for which of these cards you should avoid, that should be pretty obvious at this point. I've said it about 100 million times in my videos. Nvidia cards have a bad habit of retaining their value because of their perceived marketplace dominance. You should not pay a premium for this perception, which is a total fucking piece of bullshit concoction in the minds of fucking fanboys. Go with the AMD cards in this case. Everyone thinks they've been mined the shit out of. You can pick them up cheap. That's the way to go. Next up on the ladder, we got the GTX 1050 2GB. You can get them for 138 bucks here in Canada at the cheapest, which is a pretty good deal for what it does. And the cards lumped into this group are many. Got your GTX 680 and maybe even your 670. It's kind of in between this category and the previous one. You've got your GTX 770, which is of course just a rebrand of the 680. The 960 also fits into here, as well as the Radeon 7950 and the R9 280. Outside of the 960, I've picked all of these up at numerous points during the last 3 months for 80 bucks. The 960 being a bit newer and being Nvidia will demand a bit of a premium, but it's not that unreasonable, especially when compared to the atrocity that is the GTX 950. I have been able to acquire the odd GTX 960 for about 100 bucks, which is as high as I'd want to go. They do OC a fair bit and sort of sets them apart from this category, but considering how well the 1050 performs by comparison, again, you're starting to get into that why the fuck am I just not buying a new card sort of range when you're spending $100 and there's a $138 one sitting on the shelf that you can just pick up new with a fresh warranty, yada yada yada. Now, there's a lot of bad news in this category. The worst value is where we'll start. Obviously, any of the Kepler cards, so the 670 at the absolute bottom, and then followed closely by the 680 and 770, have all suffered thanks to that driver abandonment that Nvidia has imposed upon the architecture. So I'm just not sure how much money I would want to put into one of those nowadays. And the 7950, which used to be my go-to card, is getting kind of old, and it's actually difficult to find working ones these days, so it might be time to retire that guy. R9 280's hardly sold, so you don't really have much left in this category. And considering just how close a lot of these cards will end up selling for in comparison to the 1050, my best value for this category would in fact be 2GB 1050. I cannot give it to a secondary market card in these conditions. Things might change in a few months, but for right now, that's who gets it. Next category up is the GTX 1050 Ti level of performance. It's a weird card because there's no 6-pin power connector, which means you can put it in a pre-built and give it pretty good performance. But it's sort of being dwarfed by the RX 470 in terms of price performance, so it doesn't really have a home right now. But still, worth talking about. The cards that will match this on the secondary market in terms of performance right now are the R9 390 and the 390X, which are really not that far apart. The 280X, which was the Tahiti version that sort of comes close to the 380 depending on which card and factory OC and all that. The Radeon 7970, again, very dependent on factory OC here. The original 7970s that were released first are actually significantly slower, but the ones that were labeled Gigahertz Edition were significantly faster and actually just ended up becoming 280Xs later in life. In terms of best and worst value in this category, it's kind of hard to say because it's a bit mushy. The R9 380 and 380X are too new and will probably demand just a little bit too much and get a little bit too close to that $180 price threshold. The 7970, even if it is for about $100, is a little bit too old for me to recommend taking a risk on. The 280X kind of sits right in the middle, and you can usually get those for about $120, so that might be your go-to card, especially when you consider there's tax on top of the new thing. And the GTX 780 is just a total dud. Avoid it. I mean, you'll never get it for a price that is reasonable for the performance it provides. Leave it alone entirely. Now, the next category to me is the most interesting because it probably comprises the overwhelming majority of buyers these days, and that's sort of like the 1080p sweet spot business. So the RX 470 has actually elevated itself thanks to AMD's driver releases and driver maturation to be in line with the GTX 970, R9 290, and in some tests, if according to the most recent numbers, the R9 390. The GTX 780 Ti I've also lumped into this category, but it is obviously at the bottom of the pile and probably the worst value. Followed closely by the 970. 970s are everywhere, but because of driver maturation and because AMD has finally caught up in performance, the 970 has kind of been squeezed out of the market. I have seen them going for as low as $200 flat, but compared to a $229 brand new fucking RX 470, which performs, I think, within 2 or 3% based on the latest numbers I've seen, it's just a no-brainer. You buy the new card for that price. You spend the extra $30 and you get yourself a fresh warranty, brand new card. Now, the R9 290 is definitely the most interesting one in the category and definitely will once again get my best of award for this grouping. It can be acquired for as little as $140 to $150 if you're willing to put up with the reference version. Again, that's cutting it close. It's definitely within range to consider buying new instead, but still reasonable to get the old card. It is hot, it does consume a lot of power, but those are things I guess I'm willing to forgive if you're on an especially tight budget. And in addition, I mentioned the R9 390 in this category as well, but it's not really worth consideration. I've never actually seen one go for less than 200 flat, and again, at that price, probably not worth it. Next up, we have the RX 480 4GB, which is in its own category because it's significantly cheaper than the 8GB version and performs very, very close to it. What cards are comparable to it in this group? Well, I would put the GTX 980 firmly in this category, as well as the R9 290X. The 980 is still selling for upwards of $300+. People are actually paying this amount of money for that card, despite the fact that the RX 480 4GB performs strictly better than it in almost every test I've seen these days, many months after the initial reviews came out, remember. So the GTX 980 is an absolute no. The 290X, on the other hand, is still once again best in class at this performance level. I recently acquired 3 Sapphire Tri-X reference PCB, not custom PCB versions, for $183 a piece. I bought them as a group of $550 in total. So that's what you should be looking to target for this performance class. So again, $183 compared to the $250 price tag on the RX 480, and you're getting into that range where you can justify saving that $70 and getting something secondhand. We have the Big Daddy, the RX 480 8GB level of performance at $299 minimum here in Canada, and the only cards that it really matches up with are the R9 390X and the R9 Fury-ish. The Fury is maybe a touch faster, but they're sort of in the same group. The Fury is not a big deal because so few of them sold. There are a ton of them in overstock and refurbished supplies at major retailers, and you're never going to get them for less than the price of an RX 480 anyway. I still see them going for upwards of like $350, $375, even on the secondhand market when one occasionally pops up. So don't even bother looking at it. 390X was a little bit more available, sold a little bit better, a little bit more mainstream, and certainly is a comparable fit performance-wise to the RX 488 gigabyte. But once again, price is a limiting factor. So you'd be looking to target at the most $210, $220 for a 390X, which is only a sliver better than a 290X, but no one seems to be biting. So in this category, I have to say, I don't think there is a viable secondhand option. If you want RX 480 performance, you buy an RX 480. Next, we move on to the last category that is not in the meat, as I call it. It's not for the average gamer. It's not for your mid-range 1080p kind of schlub. Getting up into the high end now, and the GTX 1070 is the only card really worth talking about here because there is no comparison for the 1080, and there is no 1080 Ti yet, and there is no Titan X comparison. So the 1070 performs about the same as a 980 Ti, and actually the Fury X at 1440p has begun to pull in line with it as well. So those are your two comparable options. Now, being that the 1070 comes in at $513 at the absolute cheapest here in Canada, that does leave a lot of wiggle room for you to get used parts. I have seen 980 Ti's, albeit reference versions, end up selling for as low as $375 Canadian, which is certainly perfectly reasonable, and I would recommend you get them at that price, but temper your expectations because the majority of the AIB models, which are the ones that actually sold, are considerably more valuable, anywhere from $400 to $450, and at that point, maybe it's not really worth it. Fury X's, I would recommend you avoid altogether for a number of reasons that are not really related to anything I said throughout the rest of the video. So for one, it's got an all-in-one liquid cooler attached to it, and the biggest limiting factor would be that. The pump in it has already been proven to be shit, and in addition to being shit in terms of being noisy and obnoxious, pumps don't last for longer than 2 to 3 years. And if you're going to buy a card like this for $300-400, you would think if you're your average student with a summer job, you're going to want this thing to last you for a couple of years. And being that you don't know how old the card is when you buy it, it's probably not a risk you want to take. Now, granted, AIOs are something that you can replace, that is true, but they're not cheap. And even used ones that you can acquire secondhand for, $40 to $50 really makes this card not worth it. So I'd avoid it altogether. There really isn't any comparison here. It's just 980 Ti or 1070, one of the two. In closing, here are the big points I want you to take away. Number one, Kepler is bad. It's bad, bad, bad. We don't know how bad it's gonna get going forward, and nobody's gonna sell the cards for what they should actually be priced at, so it's almost not even worthwhile to look for them. Point number two, AMD is actually pushing its own secondhand cards out of the secondary market by pricing their new cards so competitively. The RX 470 and RX 480 are beating the shit out of the secondary market, pushing prices down, and here in Q1 I haven't actually seen those prices come down. People are just reluctantly and stubbornly listing them for higher, making them inviable options for the majority of people. Again, there are exceptions to this rule. I would recommend that you always look out and keep an eye open, but be prepared to just buy an RX 470 because it's a really good deal. And number three, if you didn't infer it from my little 1070 roundup there, the 513 price tag attached to the 1070 firmly puts that card at the bottom end of what I would call an enthusiast GPU, at least in terms of price, as where the X70 series in the past has sort of been upper mainstream. By comparison, the GTX 970 on release was a whole $100 cheaper here in Canada on average. And the reason this is happening is because AMD is not competitive on the high end and Nvidia has free run on the market, so they are pushing up the standard for what counts as enthusiast graphics. Anyhow, I think we're going to call that one our Q1 rundown. Follow me on Twitter at OFA. Maybe I'll tweet a dick pic every now and again. And lastly, Danny from Nerd on a Budget commissioned me with a machete and force to do a video on his channel, and it should be up this weekend. He usually uploads on Sunday, so check him out as well. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next vid.